Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined today by Aria Gerson of the Tennessean. We're going to talk Vanderbilt baseball and plenty to talk about there. I mean, a team that I think has been among the most pleasant surprises, at least in terms of the way Vanderbilt is winning games. That is certainly going to be a topic of conversation we will dive into here in just a minute. But first, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover is brought to you by PitchLogic, the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. The easy-to-use and affordable technology makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics and features used at the highest level. See pitchlogic.com for more information. First off, Ari, I appreciate you joining us. A busy time, I know, crossover season, so you're on women's basketball duty as well. So I appreciate you carving out a little bit of time this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Let's zoom in before we zoom out. So last weekend, Vanderbilt, a sweep of Auburn. I didn't think they'd sweep that series. Auburn, just such a solid team. They're kind of like I call them a steady hand program. They're just, kind of as consistent as anybody. But Vanderbilt pulls off the sweep. What is your big picture takeaway from the sweep last weekend?
Yeah, I just think that offensively, Vanderbilt showed that, against an SEC team with SEC pitching, more velocity than they've been seeing at times, that what they were doing offensively was continued to work. And that doesn't just include the hitting, but also like the stolen bases and the stuff that they're doing to kind of push defenses, that also continued working. And so I think it provided more optimism that their offensive approach can continue to work, as well as just another really good performance from Carter Holton in particular, that the rotation is kind of rounding more into form after, it was a little iffy the first couple weeks.
Yeah, it feels like on the offense, there's some things that are happening that are sustainable, perhaps, and we'll talk about some of those, but there are also things that are unsustainable. Like I saw the other day, one of the games, there were like 15 singles, and like, you're probably not going to have 15 singles more, all that often. So what is your confidence level that what we're seeing is, I'll answer myself rather than just putting you on the spot. Like, I feel like what they're doing is largely sustainable, even if there are little individual unsustainable aspects of it. But where are you on that question?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of sustainability, they did beat Belmont 3-1 last night, so they did not have 15 singles. But I agree with you. I think that it's largely sustainable, and the reason why is because the lineup is so deep. And when I say deep, I don't just mean like 6 or 7 guys. I mean like 11, 12 guys that are all at least like average producers in some way. Whether it's, some of them are maybe more batting average driven, some might be more like power driven. It's different types of hitters, but they can all put up at least average production. So no matter who's in the lineup in any given day, you're not going to have a lot of holes. There's also not necessarily a lot of star power, but I think when you have that many guys that are at least viable offensively, that if one guy, is slumping for some amount of time, you can just put in somebody else and it'll be not too much of a drop off. So I think that aspect of it can sustain. And I also just think the aspect of it where they are stealing so many bases, maybe there's some teams that's going to work against better than others. But at the same time, like their base running is so good, and there's not a lot of other teams in the SEC that do this. And so I think that there's some teams and some defenses that are not going to be prepared for it the same way that you would see with Kentucky. But I think Vanderbilt's even better at doing it than Kentucky is. And they're also better hitting than Kentucky is. So it's like Kentucky on steroids, kind of, where I think you're going to see a lot of teams that are like, well, how do we defend this? And they just have no idea.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Yeah, it's what Kentucky's doing with blue chip recruits and at most positions. One of the big catalysts has been the step forward taken by Alan Espinal. So far, what have you gleaned about what has changed for him, what he's doing better, and to what extent did you see maybe this coming? Obviously, the Jack Bulger injury has helped, at least in terms of giving him opportunity. But I wonder if you saw some of this coming as the lead up to the season was going along.
Yeah, so I can say I was pretty high on Alan Espinal coming into the season. He had a good preseason. He was hitting a lot of home runs in the scrimmages, and also just the fact that last year, especially towards the end of the season, you kind of started to notice that teams were stealing a ton of bases when Jack Bulger was catching, that he was having trouble throwing runners out. And Louisville in particular was a team that took advantage of that. And once they did that, they stole like 6 bases or something in one game. And then everybody started doing it. And at that point, it was like, okay, well, Espinal had already started to see more time at catcher after that point. And so I was thinking that he was going to see more playing time. Now, I wasn't thinking that he was going to be in the lineup every single game like he has been, but I was thinking that he was going to see most of the time at catcher. And I was thinking that he was going to show a lot of power production, like potentially double-digit home run type power if he had enough playing time. But what I didn't see coming is like the hitting for a high batting average and high on base percentage. Now, I don't know. He probably won't be hitting 392 forever, but he has cut his strikeout rate some. It's still a little bit high, but it's not like super high. And he's just hitting the ball so hard. Like he had a 115-mile-an-hour home run in the tournament in Houston that they went to. So even when he like hits balls on the ground, like he gets a lot of infield singles because he hits the ball so hard that like they don't make the play in time. And I think that it's just, the fact that he's a veteran, he is a senior. And so you get a lot of these guys who've just been around long enough to be able to like figure things out at some point, and that he's finally gotten the playing time that he didn't have the past couple years, and then has been able to put it together from that.
The most impressive freshman, at least on the position player side, has been Cam Kozeal. I going into the season, I kind of thought it might be a toss up. Like the best freshman might be Kozeal, but it might also be Braden Holcomb. But Kozeal has really been the guy there. What have you seen from him so far?
Yeah, so he's been banged up the past couple of weeks. He's been in and out of the lineup, but when he's in the lineup, I've been so impressed by his plate approach. Like he doesn't chase very much. He doesn't strike out very much. And after he had that big weekend in Houston, I had said, like, people are going to start pitching to him differently. Like he's not going to see as much stuff in the strike zone, like all this stuff. And I was curious to see how that would go. And the next couple games that he played, he was still, he wasn't having 8 hits in one weekend like he did that tournament, because that's probably not going to ever happen again. But he was still, his approach was still good. He was still making hard contact, and he seemed to not, have any issues with that. So it'll be a matter of, at least once he's back regularly in the lineup, of just, again, SEC, higher velocity, better breaking pitches, that kind of thing, facing left-handed pitchers in particular, tough lefties, which he has had the opportunity to do in Vanderbilt scrimmages, because Vanderbilt has some of the most innings by lefties of any team. But, I've just been really impressed, like I said, with the approach. And I feel like he doesn't take at bats like a freshman.
Switching to the mound, and I wrote down some notes on this particular question to make sure I got everything. If I'd have told you all the following before the season was going to be true: Andrew Dukanich would be hurt, Levi Huseman would have 1 appearance, Sawyer Hawks would have a 10.50 ERA, Sam Plaboki would have an 11.81 ERA, and Ethan McIlvain wouldn't necessarily be the immediate, like supernova star that we thought he maybe could be. What would you have assumed about the pitching staff, and how is that different than what they've been in reality?
Yeah, well, I think so. On one hand, I would say that I was pretty much right in my assumptions about what the rotation was going to look like. I thought that obviously Holton and Futrell, assuming that Holton was healthy, which he is, would be there. And then I thought that Bryce Cunningham had performed the best out of anybody in the preseason and in the fall of the other candidates for the rotation. So I kind of thought that he had the leg up for that third spot. So the rotation, my assumptions, I think, would have pretty much stayed the same. But as far as the other stuff that you just listed, I mean, I would have been like, well, the bullpen is like a major, major issue then. And it sort of has been an issue still, but they've had more freshmen than I think anyone was expecting that have been pretty good to great in the bullpen. And they've been giving a lot of innings to the freshmen. And I think that's the part that I knew there was going to be some freshmen that were going to pitch some, but not to this extent for sure. And I think that's the part that would have really surprised me. And again, like all that stuff that you listed, like I would have been like, well, the bullpen is a major problem. And they've sort of it was the first couple weeks of the season, but they've been able to kind of shore it up a little bit. And especially as the starters have been going deeper.
Among those freshman relievers, because they've just had freshmen step up in those roles, who do you feel like has opened the most eyes?
Probably Brennan Cyber, because they've been kind of using him as like a co-closer with Ryan Ginther. And he's more of a, he's not going to end up on Pitching Ninja or anything, because he's more of like a sinker guy who, isn't going to rack up a ton of strikeout numbers, but he has like a 70% ground ball rate or something like that, like crazy ground ball rate. So he just comes in, gets grounders, throws strikes. So anytime that they want someone in the game who, again, isn't going to walk guys and can get some grounders, like that's him. And he has been very poised, and he's been very able to pitch in close games without having like a lot of blow ups or anything like that. So I think that's been really the guy that, he was not a highly regarded recruit. He was not a name that anybody was paying any attention to at any point before the season started. He was pitching enough in the preseason that I thought that he was going to pitch some. I thought maybe he might be a midweek starter or something like that. But I didn't think that he was going to be like pitching high leverage relief innings for sure. Like he's been the guy that's put up the best numbers of any of them.
What about in the rotation? Bryce Cunningham is the guy who stands out to me. I think we knew what we had in Holton, and Futrell, as divisive as sometimes he can be, because I think it breaks people's brains a little bit that he's so effective with stuff that just doesn't really impress anybody. But we knew he's one of those guys, when the lights come on, he's fine. Like I don't worry about him at all. But Cunningham's step forward has been impressive, because this is not like this is some fresh face. Like he's been on the roster the last 3 years. Good stuff, command issues. What has been the difference this year that has allowed him to, at least through 5 weeks, kind of stick in this role?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, the command has improved some. And I think that like when he does walk batters, like he had 3 walks against Auburn, but I thought that the strike zone was pretty small that game. And when he was missing, it wasn't like major missing. It was only by a little bit. So the command has been better. I think he's been more comfortable throwing his changeup in particular, and his slider, but especially the changeup, I think. And just more poised and more better pitchability. Like I feel like last season, what would happen is like he'd walk a batter, he'd give up a hit or something, and then like would just unravel after that. And that's not happening this year. He's been able to stay within himself whenever things go wrong. And I think that that's been the biggest difference, because last year his ERA was really bad. His peripherals were better than his ERA was. But I think that's, like I said, that's the difference, is just better handling of adversity that's probably come with experience. Like he went to the Cape and he pitched, all fall and all preseason. And so I think that just having the extra experience has led to him being able to do more of that. And then he's also, been able to hold his velocity deep into games and things like that as well.
Back to the bullpen real quick. You mentioned the bullpen has still at times been a little bit of a question, and it stands to reason that it might, just because when you're leaning on freshmen, the freshman wall is a very real thing, especially in the SEC. And sometimes it's not so much fatigue as it's just like, hey, these hitters are really good. So maybe the success of the freshmen starts to level off at some point. What are you still optimistic about in the bullpen that maybe has not to this point clicked just yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, they just got David Horn back he missed about 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks of the season. He just got back, and he's mostly been pitching in midweeks for now because they're still trying to bring him along. But I think that once he gets built all the way back up and whatnot, he will be pitching in SEC weekends. And I think that he was somebody who looked like he was poised to take a step forward in the preseason before he missed time. So I think that getting him back will be a really good addition to the bullpen in whatever role that they choose to use him in, which I'm not sure yet what role that would be, but whatever it is, he could pitch in a lot of different roles, and I think he will really help. And then I think when you have so many newcomers, not just the freshmen, but also the transfers, like, I think that there's sort of this idea of maybe like they just need to like figure it out a little bit, and has not necessarily happened yet, but could still happen. Like sometimes you see that happen like in April or even in May. And when it's, I don't know that it's necessarily going to happen for everybody that's been underperforming or that might still hit the freshman wall or whatever, but you don't necessarily need it to be everybody. If it's just like a couple guys that end up, taking a mid-season step forward. And I think there's more reason to believe that will happen just because of a combination of the talent level that's there. And also, like I said, the fact that everybody is so new, other than like Ryan Ginther and Sam Laboki. Everybody else is like freshman, transfer, has barely pitched, like all this stuff. So I think that's kind of the optimism, such as it is.
I always say one of the trickiest things in college baseball is early in the season, you might have guys that are just unpitchable for whatever reason. They're maybe not fully built up. They're just whatever it is. And then finding a way to kind of fold those pitchers back in as time goes on, because they say, the cliche is it's a long season, and I get what they mean, but not really. We have 9 weeks left, right? I mean, and you get one midweek game, maybe two some weeks to kind of tinker a little, but you also don't want to lose those games because those can be RPI killers. So it's just so complicated. I'm always really impressed with the coaching staffs that are able to do that effectively. And we see that every year. We get to May and somebody in the SEC tournament or a regional or what have you has some guy who had 3 appearances the first half of the year and then all of a sudden figured it out in April and then caught fire. But that to me is the trickiest thing. So when you look at the stat sheet and you see some of these guys that haven't pitched, have bad ERAs or whatever, I can guarantee you, and you and I could sit here and speculate, but I can guarantee you some subset of those guys are going to be really good in May. And we just have no idea which ones they are yet. and that's just tricky.
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes I think it's just chance that it happens. Like I can give you an example from last year was David Horn, where he had missed some time towards the beginning of the season. He was out for like 6 weeks, came back in a midweek against Indiana State and gave up like 7 runs in 2 innings, I think. And then he just was not pitching because they were like, okay, we can't pitch this guy. And then they go to Louisville for this midweek in May, and they did not have very many pitchers available because everybody was injured. They weren't going to pitch their weekend starters that were available. Like Holton was out, Hunter Owen was out. They weren't going to use Futrell in a midweek. Like they only had like 10 pitchers available or something. Like it was not very many.
Yeah.
So they were doing a staff game, but then the game went into extra innings and they had one pitcher who was even available to pitch, and it was David Horn. So they were like, all right, well, it's him or a position player. So he went into the game and he pitched, I think, 3 scoreless innings to and Vanderbilt ended up winning that game in 12 innings. So after that, he then pitched against Arkansas the next week, and also they still didn't have very many pitchers available. He was good against Arkansas too. And then it was like, well, okay, this guy is useful now. So sometimes it's just like something like that where like, you have that one extra innings game where somebody just needs to pitch. And like you said, I think that there was even one kind of this season where like against Texas, they were down 11-3, put Sawyer Hawks in the game because they were like, all right, well, this is low leverage situation. He pitches 2 innings scoreless. By the time he's done with his second inning, they're up 12-11. I actually think when he came in the game, they were not down 11-3. They were down like 11-5 or something like that. But it was still like they were down by a lot, is my point. And by the time he left the game, they were actually leading and he got the win. So like it was like a low leverage situation that turned into a high leverage situation, basically.
So. You never know what situations will arise. Aria, on our way out here, why don't you go ahead and plug where listeners can find your work and can follow your work as the season rolls on?
Yeah, you can find my work at Tennessean.com, TENNESSEAN.com. You can also follow me on X/Twitter at Aria_Gerson.
This is the portion, I've done this several times already this season, which speaks to the quality of the beat writing around SEC baseball, but I will now embarrass my guest. Aria is one of the very best doing it as an SEC baseball beat writer, and there might not be anyone. It's her or Jacob Rudner at 247 Sports with Florida in terms of taking numbers, taking data, and providing context as to here's what this means. Here's why these numbers might be deceiving. Here's why this is not maybe quite what you think it is. And that in college baseball, a world in which those types of takes have not really been out there. I mean, the data has not really been out there a lot of times, but that's just new and different and exciting in college baseball beat writing because it's not something we typically have. Aria does it as well as anybody in the league, probably as well as anybody in the nation. So make sure you're following her work because not just on Vanderbilt, but as Vanderbilt has SEC opponents, she oftentimes has good insight on those opponents from looking at the numbers. So your team could likely be a part of that. So Aria, I appreciate you joining us today. Continue the good work the rest of the season. I think I speak for all of the listeners when I say we're looking forward to reading you the rest of the way.
Thank you.
That'll do it for this episode of Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. Thank you to Pitch Logic for sponsoring this and every episode of Highway to Hoover. Thank you again to Aria for joining me, and thank you, the listener, for listening.